introduce my teacher, my mentor, Padma Shri Dr. V. Mohan. As sir has requested, I will not go into the details. So over to you, sir. So everybody is eager to listen to you. Thank you, sir.
So let me first share my slides. Is it seen? My slides are seen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, Manoj. Thank you, Purvi, for this invitation. It's always nostalgic to talk about insulin, particularly on the exact date, as Ian pointed out, to the day when the first human being received insulin in the world. I think it's a very nostalgic event, and I want to congratulate the organizers for thinking of this and event and inviting me. Also wish to thank Jaydeep for the kind words. In the interest of time, since we're already several minutes behind, I'll go through my presentation fairly quickly. And I would like to take off where Ian Bloomer left off, because he introduced the discovery of insulin. And as I very briefly mentioned when I was making a comment after his talk, until last year, actually, we did not know what happened in India. I don't know how these things get lost in India. But even my father, who had started, I'll talk about that, in the post-independence era, got into diabetes, knew very little actually about what had happened before. Several times I have sat with him and asked him, and he hardly knew anything. And I can't blame him, because in the pre-independence time, I don't think the British were actually encouraging Indian doctors to come and tell and so on. So it's kind of buried history, just like, everything is kind of buried under the, like in Mahabalipuram, when you go, you see one, a temple, but there are 6 more under the sea. So like that, the shore temple. So like that, I think is how history of diabetes in general and insulin in India gets buried. Since there's limited time, I'm not going to talk about the whole history of diabetes in India, but I'll just speak about the insulin. And since this is also a topic going into how we got to where we were with the insulins, I'll touch upon some parts of it in my own lifetime with insulin. Incidentally, this year I complete 50 years after I entered medicine and after I started my first research project on diabetes. So exactly 100th year of insulin coincides with 50 years of my entry into diabetes. This you have seen how the very slide actually were not planned when Ian Bloomer wrote to me this morning. I didn't know he's going to show you the same slide. But this is a dramatic recovery of insulin, which he described so well. And that's the first commercial insulin which was available. And look at the date. I want you to see the date there. It's 1923. So he talked about 1921, he talked about 1922. But then after the insulin was used in human beings, that's when George Cloves got into the picture from Eli Lilly. And it was he who persuaded them to hand over the commercial production to Lilly. And almost at the same year, 23, Novo and Nordisk had also started production in Denmark. And very soon, the whole world was producing it in England and in many other places. But this is Ileton, produced by Eli Lilly in 1923. So the question then came up, between 1920 to 23, when insulin was being discovered in Toronto, what is happening in India when Banting and Best were doing their experiments? Was there a single doctor in India who was working on diabetes? Turns out that a lot of work was actually being done on diabetes. And when did insulin come to India? None of these questions were known. I asked all the pundits. I wrote to everyone in India. I wrote to all the pharmaceutical companies. I wrote to Novo. I wrote to Sanofi. I wrote to Lilly. I wrote to everybody I can think of, all the physicians. Not one of them knew anything about this. So then I had to do my own research, and through that discovered something. And that led to this paper, which some of you are involved in. And I must thank my student, Bavadarani, who actually lives in Toronto. She's a postdoctoral fellow. And she's the one who actually arranged my trip to the Banting and Best Center. And Ian Bloomer actually didn't mention, actually threw a dinner for me, where he had invited all the top scientists of Toronto for that dinner. Of course, Satyanath also helped me to get out a lot of data about the Calcutta story. Dr. Nalaperumal is a historian. He didn't have any of this data, but he had so much of other history to share with me. And of course, Mangesh helped me in the rapid publication, and Ranjit and Anjana also helped me in writing this article. If any of you have not read this article, please read it. because I think what happened in India before independence, you must know. And because nobody knew it, I don't think even my father knew it. I don't think any of the seniors knew it. So I think you should read it, if nothing else, to pay homage to the great people who had treated diabetes in India before independence. So here are some dates. 1923 was when I told you that insulin was discovered by Eli Lilly. 23 was also a time when Nova started, and 23 was also the year when the Nobel Prize was awarded in October 23. But here is March 23 and the Indian Medical Gazette, which talks about insulin and diabetes in India. So it's already arrived in India. So you can see how fast at that time, almost 100 years ago, how quickly the British had brought the insulin into India. And here is another one in August 23, which even talks about the benefits of insulin, who should take it, who should not take it. And of course, a lot of debates about which I'm not going to be given me an hour to talk. I had a lot of interesting things to talk, but I'll very quickly go through it. Now, this is the first brand of insulin which came to India, the AB brand. And AB stands for Allen and Hanbury is the A, and B is the British drug houses. And so it's a collaboration, and this was produced, and you can see the date here, issued on May 1924. And this is an actual batch of insulin which was used in India at that time. And this is in 1924. So you can see they actually preserved it. And there are photographs of that which I was able to get. And so from license from the Medical Research Council in the UK, they produced it. Now, the first type 1 diabetic, probably type 1 diabetic, could have been type 2 because there's no other treatment at the time. There's no sulfonylurea, no metformin, nothing at that time. They were only giving juices and some Ayurvedic concoctions and so on at that time. So there is a first case of diabetic coma treated with insulin by Dr. Proctor. And this is an Englishman who has treated a 35-year-old female. So it could be type 1, could be type 2, could be LADA, could be anything. But on 23rd August 1923, this particular lady was treated, and then she recovers from her diabetes. So this is the first treated case in India who received insulin. If you want to know who's the first treated case, then it would be this case. Unfortunately, only case number 503 is mentioned, and the name is not mentioned. So we don't know the name of this particular person. But then that's a time when this hero of mine, Dr. Jyoti Prakash Bose, entered the scene. My father had not even mentioned his name. He mentioned that there was a person in Calcutta. I don't think he even knew of Dr. Bose. Neither did Dr. Bose know my father, although Bose died only in 1968, by which time my father was very active. And in 1966, the World Congress of Diabetes took part in Bombay. I don't think Dr. J.P. Bose took part, but my father took part. Dr. Ajgonka took part, Dr. M.M.S. Ahuja, who had just entered the scene, took part, B.B. Tripathi took part, many others took part. I don't think Jyoti Prakash Bose took part because he was already quite old at that time. And but it was J.P. Bose who, because his father, K.C. Bose, Kailash Chandra Bose, he was the person who was a freedom fighter who went to England, represented India at Exeter, and then he came back and told his 13-year-old son that he has to take up medicine. Quite sentimental to me because I was 13 when my father told me to take up to medicine and diabetes. And J.C. Bose, J.P. Bose, as a young boy, then decided to do medicine. He studied in Calcutta. He went to England, got fully trained, and came back. And he and his father are probably the only father and son in India who were elected fellows of the Chemical Society. It's supposed to be a very, very big honor, something like our FRS today. And both father and son were elected. J.P. Bose, you can write books about him, the kind of knowledge that he had. I don't think any Indian diabetologist subsequently also had, because he was a biochemist, he was a clinician, he wrote books, he did research, he published everything in pre-independent India. And I can write a whole book on him. In fact, he is mentioned quite a lot in my latest book, which will soon come out. But this is his classic paper on diabetes mellitus in children, published in 1930. You can see just 7 years after insulin was discovered, he has already got his series and he's got it published. Those days to publish a paper takes 2-3 years. So he probably submitted this in 27 or 28, and here you are. And he's talking about the incidence of the childhood diabetes in 1930, almost 100 years ago. And there he mentions, in all humility, that the late Rai Bahadur UN Sen reported a case of diabetes 6 years. There was a definite history of diabetes in the family, and the child suffered from congenital syphilis. And the youngest case in my series was an acute case of diabetes in an Anglo-Indian boy. But he has not mentioned the names of these two. So these two probably had type 1 diabetes and they were treated. But then he goes on to write a full report on this. And he says that I have a 12-year-old girl with me. And to save space, I've curtailed my notes and I've only given a few salient features. You should read his English. It's a masterpiece of English that he writes. And so there he talks about this girl. And that's how, for the first time, we came to know about the real heroine of type 1 diabetes, the equivalent of the Leonard Thompson, and that's Kumudini. And we know because her name is mentioned. She was 12 years old. She was a Bengali Hindu female. Believe it or not, she got married at the age of 10. And after the age of 10, by 12 years, I think she had become like this. She had developed type 1 diabetes. And she was brought to the Calcutta School of Tropical Diseases on 23rd June 1929, almost half dead. And then after her treatment, she becomes like this. So we have now got the Indian photos to match what our Ian Bloomer and the Canadians and the rest of the world had shown. We don't know the names of these two, the boy and this girl here, but you can see the dramatic improvement, exactly like the Toronto cases. And this girl who was in a wheelchair now becomes a young girl. I'm trying to trace these people, but we don't even know their names. And so it's very, very difficult to trace. But I must say that I have traced J.P. Bose's granddaughter, both the granddaughters, and I've had chats with them, and they still remember their grandfather, how he used to wear a rose on his suit when he went, and every day the rose will come from the market, and he used to wear it. And he was brilliant. He was simply brilliant. He was excellent clinician, researcher, and so on. And I've got many stories about J.P. Bose. But all that actually changed in 1947. And in 1947, my father, who was meant to be a GP to the Maharaja of Chettinad, that was his first job that he got. While accompanying the Maharaja to Chettinad, the Maharaja died. And so he had no job. So he came back, and that's how the first diabetic clinic was started at the Stanley Medical College and Hospital in 1948. Officially recognized as the first diabetic clinic in India, but there was a clinic earlier in 1920s itself in Calcutta. And unfortunately, I think that closed down in that particular form. And then that my father had told me, there was a clinic which closed down, he told me. That's the only thing he knew about the Calcutta clinic. But then this later got upgraded into a clinic, into a department, and now it is a full-fledged institute for diabetology. For those of you who have not visited, you should visit this historic place. It's as important as going to Toronto and seeing Banting and Best to see where it all started in India, in Chennai. Now, when I joined him in 1971, these were the insulins which were available in India. We had plain insulin, we had lente insulin, PZI insulin, NPH insulins. These insulins were made in Maharashtra and by Boots and from the license given from England, but they were manufactured in India. They're mostly from bovine sources. Later, porcine insulin also came. But they were called as dirty insulins because they resulted in allergy, lipoatrophy, lipohypertrophy, insulin resistance, and antibody formation. These are early papers where in the 1970s and 80s, we were doing work on insulin antibodies and showing that if you take these insulins, you develop antibodies. Then came the purified insulins, particularly the monocomponent insulin from Novo, which led to much less decrease in allergy and lipoatrophy. But even with animal insulins, there were problems because the Muslims would not take pork insulin, Hindus didn't like to take beef insulin, and still the allergies and the lipoatrophy and so on continued. When we even reported a case of allergy to monocomponent insulin. We even reported a case of allergy to human insulin after it first came. Of course, most of those papers were then published in Indian journals. We didn't know how to write for foreign journals. These are all still when I was a student. MBBS and MD student. But you can see how we did the allergy testing and how we proved it. Then we also showed that after giving this monocomponent insulins, the insulin antibody levels came down. You can see 24,000 units, micro units per ml coming down to 48, and 15,000 coming down to 1,000, and so on, 9,000 coming to 700. So you can see dramatic reduction in the antibody levels once you switch from these animal insulins to the purified insulins. Then came a shocker, and this shocker came in 1975. I was just completing my fourth year at the time when I read this report, and what they showed was what will be the production of porcine insulin. This is what I'm showing here. if you keep extrapolating it, how many pigs can you slaughter to get insulin? And then what will be the world's requirement of insulin? And when they drew the graph, they drew a point here at 1992, and they said the world is going to end for all type 1 diabetics and all those needing insulin, because the world cannot supply insulin anymore, because that's all you can get. That's all pigs and that's all cows you can get. So you cannot, the people are going to die in 1992. That was the prediction. But then necessity is a mother of invention. And in 1981, to cut a long story short, human insulin was produced without any animals, and using the recombinant DNA technology, which is shown here. So using E. coli bacteria, one group of bacteria produced the A chain, the other group produced the B chain, and then they were combined by air oxidation to produce the first genetically engineered human insulin. Very quickly, Novo started converting their porcine insulin, semi-synthetic insulin, into human insulin. It was a painful process, very costly. Then they started using yeast and produced their own variety of human insulin. And of course, then human insulin really came. The promise was that there will be never, ever any human being in the world should die because of lack of insulin, because there's going to be enough insulin. There was also one promise given that it will become very, very cheap, that insulin will become very, very cheap. The second part of it still hasn't come true, because even today, even in countries like US, people have to are rationing their insulin because they cannot afford it. But human insulin also had its problems. As I showed you, the first case of human insulin allergy was reported by us in 1981. And then it also doesn't mimic the pharmacological or physiological, the role or profile of insulin. And so the designer insulins came, and we heard about all of them. The short-acting ones produced by Lilly and Novo in Aspart, Lispro, and fast-acting Aspart of Fiasp. And then the long-acting ones came, Glargine, Detimar, and Degludec. The pre-mixed ones came, and now we have the co-formulations about which Dr. Rajput also talked about, Aspart, but Degludec combination. So I'm going to end here by saying that a lot has happened in diabetes in pre-independence India, especially by Dr. J.P. Bose, but there is Dr. A. Mitra and many others. It's a whole story by itself. But he's largely forgotten hero, and I think we have to institute something in Dr. J.P. Bose's name. And then we had the crude AB insulins of 1924, but we have come a long, long way since then. And today we have pens, and we have pumps, and we have all kinds of ways to deliver insulin. And therefore, my plea in 2022 would be that we should aim for a complications-free India. We've got all the tools today. We've got all the methods. We know how to prevent complications in India. And why should we not have a diabetes complications-free India? As long as I live in this earth, this is going to be my concept and my ambition, that we work towards a complications-free India. And on that note, Jai Hind, and thank you.